Wonderful Thursday evening. Yes, after work story, part 2 of the beautiful book about a wonderful woman that lived a long time ago, a voice of her own, the story of Phyllis Wheatley. Yes, and it's a different way of spelling her name, not with a Y, but Phillis, Wheatley. And the author is Catherine Lasky and illustrated by Paul Lee. All right, so I didn't realize that it'll probably be a part 2 or part 3, but we left with Phyllis learning how to read. We know that she was taken from her mother at approximately the age of 7 or 8. She was snag-a-tooth. She was stripped from her family, and every time she would see the sun, she would think about her beautiful mother because of the gold dress. And when she would see water spill, it would remind her of her mother. And it like I said, this is not the book for everybody, but especially this being Women's History Month, this really celebrates the genius of females of all ages, of all dispensations. So let's dive right in. Let's see how far we could go. Candle, quill, and ink. Candle, quill, and ink. Oh, sound like some writing's gonna go on. You see that? A candle flickered. Its flame spun a gold cocoon of light. In the corner of the room where Phyllis sat at a desk, copying Bible passages. And we know that she was purchased, right? The couple wanted a teenager or someone older to be the slave owner's wife's servant. And then she was like, well, I'll take this little girl and maybe I can show her some things. So this is the time of a terrible chapter, multiple chapters of history. So Phyllis sat at a desk copying Bible passages. Susanna Wheatley, which is her slave owner or the slave owner's wife, was so impressed with Phyllis's progress. She had given her books and the tools with which Phyllis could study whenever she had spare time. A candle, a quill, and a pot of ink. Oh, she was obsessed, huh? Oh yeah, to show the genius, to learn. Phyllis had been in America a mere 16 months, that's it. And within that short time, she had learned not only to speak English, come on y'all, as far as us who's trying to learn a foreign language. In 16 months, that's a year and a quarter, or a year and a third. She had accomplished so much. So she learned to speak English, but not only that, she learned how to write it. And she read the Bible and understood some of the hardest passages. Many of these she copied down. She was only 9 years old. Oh my goodness, I didn't know that. 9 years old, learned a foreign language, learned how to speak, read, and write the foreign language, and read the Bible, some of the hardest passages. Oh my goodness. But to learn a foreign language, many of these she copied down. She was only 9 years old and she had already learned more than some white colonial girls and women ever in life read or did. Phyllis began with English and then moved on to study Latin, and then Greek, geography, and mathematics. Well learned. What she enjoyed most, though, was poetry. She liked the clear, sharp images, the pictures that poems made in her mind. Oh my goodness. A genius cultivated, like all of our children. We just have to see what subject do they prefer? It might not be poetry. Maybe it is a science. Maybe it is music. Something. Okay, let's look at this picture. One afternoon in 1765, while serving visitors lunch, Phyllis listened to an amazing tale. So just listen. Just picture her. Mr. Hussey and Mr. Coffin, just arrived from Nantucket, were telling of their terrifying voyage to Boston. Their ship had nearly sunk off Cape Cod in the late winter storm. They described waves as high as mountains, a shrieking wind that tore sails to shreds, and that splintered masts. How had the two men survived? Were they scared to death? The images of the two men lashed by the storm began to build in her mind's eye. What a miracle that these same two men now sat safe and warm at the Wheatley table. Very soon after this, Phyllis composed a poem describing Mr. Hussey's and Mr. Coffin's fearful voyage. This poem was published 2 years later in 1767. So she had to be around, 11 years old maybe? But she started working on it at 9, 10 years old. 11. In the newspaper, it was published in 1767. We're talking about over 350 years ago. In the newspaper Newport Mercury. It is said to be Phyllis's very first published poem. Phyllis was just 14 years old, so sometime after that it was published. Susanna Wheatley was stunned. Her little experiment in trying to prove that black people from Africa could read and write had gone beyond her wildest dreams. So much more. That's why I'm saying there's no excuse. Young man today told me he is so enamored. He's very gifted, kind of busy, but he said, I want to be a runner. That's why I did my Black History poster project on Jesse Owens. I said, you're gonna be just as famous. Come on, it's in us. You gotta find what sparks their joy. You do have to study every child. It's different for each one. She was so excited that she began to take Phyllis into the parlors of the finest families in Boston so Phyllis could read her poems. Look at that. Look how dignified, how patient, away from everybody. No, thank you, Phyllis would say softly when the mistress of one of those fine houses offered her a place at the tea table. She might then nod toward a smaller table off to the side and offer to sit there. The hostess would usually seem relieved and order her own slaves to set a single place at the side table for the Negro poet. Oh my goodness, that reminded me of Amanda, the poet laureate, the youngest one who read for President Biden's inauguration. Amanda Gorman, come on now. The Negro poet, huh? This was the home of Timothy Fitch. When Phyllis herself thought she could not stay another minute and started to leave, Mrs. Fitch fluttered about, insisting that she stay. The daughter sat silently. It was an awful afternoon for everyone. Phyllis was sipping tea in the house of the man who was responsible for her kidnapping. Oh my goodness. On that note, I gotta sip some tea myself. Oh my goodness. Can you imagine that you're the choice entertainment and you are in the residence, you're in the company of the person who did you so dirty? But look at the dignity, look at the strength that she maintained. Oh, come on. This is for us. This is for us, you all. Oh my goodness. When people treat us terribly, you got to have it. It's in you. You don't lash back. You don't seek revenge. You keep your head up high. And if you have to look away and distract yourself with something else, distract yourself with the future and your greatness and your genius. Oh my goodness. Okay. So, daughter sat silently. Yes, it was terrible. So, Phyllis was sipping tea, and as she watched Mrs. Fitch pour tea from an elegant teapot, maybe she thought of her own mother. Oh my goodness. Pouring water from a calabash in the first light of the morning sun. It was indeed that same sun that shone in both Boston and Africa. And these women were all mothers. Perhaps that was what shocked Phyllis most of all. They were all mothers. Yeah. Black or white. But the children of the white ones had not been kidnapped. Oh my goodness. This is called With Secret Rage, this chapter. Liberty, property, and no stamps. The hoarse cries from the mobs in the streets. The hoarse cries, yes, the scratchy cries, could be heard inside the Wheatley mansion. From their windows, the Wheatley family could see the unruly mob building. A dozen or more patriots carried a coffin on their shoulders, in which lay an effigy of the newly appointed stamp master of Boston. The people of Boston were seething mad because a new tax by England had been placed upon every newspaper, legal document, letter, announcement, even decks of cards. The mob continued on to the stamp building, which they destroyed. Then they rushed to the house of the stamp master and began to smash the windows. Phyllis started to consider the issue of freedom. The colonies in which Phyllis lived as a slave were struggling to slip the chains of their own enslavement to England. And from the house on King Street, she was seeing this new struggle erupt. Phyllis began writing about the violence of the streets of Boston and sometimes the violence of being a slave. In her poem, America, she wrote about the Stamp Act that England had placed on her colonies. She laid some taxes on her darling son and would have laid another act thereon. Why weeps Americus? Why weeps my child? Thus spake Britannia, thus benign and mild. The images of America's struggle for freedom and Phyllis's kidnapping and enslavement sometimes overlapped within a poem. In one poem, Phyllis explains the source of her love of freedom. I, young in life, was snatched from Africa's fancied happy seat. And she still wondered how her parents must have worried. What sorrows labor in my parents' breast? In February of 1770, a mob of young, angry patriots surrounded the house of a British informer who came out with a gun and shot into the crowd. Christopher Snyder fell dead, a bullet in his chest. He was 11 years old. The death of a child shocked everyone, even the British, Phyllis thought. And in her poem about the death of Christopher Snyder, she wrote about the secret rage in every heart when a child is senselessly murdered. Phyllis called Christopher the first martyr of the revolution. 2 weeks after Christopher Snyder's death, there was more violence, more blood, and it all began with a snowball fight right on Phyllis's own street, King Street. It was the Boston Massacre. A group of people began throwing snowballs at the British soldiers. One soldier cocked his rifle and shot. Phyllis wrote a poem about the massacre. One of the men who died in the massacre was black, a former slave. His name was Crispus Attucks. He was the first black martyr of the revolution. Let's see. I think one more. Let's do one more chapter. My Phyllis. If he hasn't the impudence to sit upon the same seat with my Phyllis. Susanna Wheatley was filming as she saw the carriage draw up in front of the house on King Street. Phyllis, who suffered from colds and asthma, was sitting on the driver's seat next to Prince in the cold weather. Susanna Wheatley fretted constantly over Phyllis's health. Prince was scolded severely for encouraging Phyllis to sit beside him, especially in the cold. Phyllis felt confused. She sat at side tables, but she was not supposed to sit on the same carriage bench as a Negro. Black on the outside, educated like a white, yet not permitted, except in the Wheatley family, to join whites at the table. Was there any place that she really belonged? It seemed to Phyllis she was halfway between two worlds. Even in church, which she attended with the Wheatleys, there was a separate place for Negroes to sit. Oh my. But still, Phyllis loved church. She was fascinated by the Reverend George Whitefield, who came from England to preach in America. Mr. Whitefield believed that true Christianity meant love of everyone, orphans, paupers, Indians, and slaves. The Reverend even went so far as to say that it was sinful for the white man to enslave his black brother. Beautiful. The spiritual world of which George Whitefield spoke, the Christian God that saw no color, was an inspiration for much of Phyllis's poetry. Within the spiritual world, Phyllis felt free. Within her poetry, she felt neither white nor black. When Whitefield died, Phyllis was just 16. The loss she felt when he died stirred her. Just as the memory of her mother always made her think of the sun, so did that of George Whitefield. He had brought light to the minds of New England people as they worshiped. So in her mind, Phyllis held once again the image of a sun, brilliant and shining. She wrote a poem in honor of George Whitefield. Unhappy we, thy setting sun deplore, which once was splendid, but it shines no more. The poem was published as a broadside or handbill and read on both sides of the Atlantic, in the colonies and in England. At 17, Phyllis became famous. Yes, we will stop there. So, we're now at the mid-end of her teenage years. It's so interesting that she was given a gift and she used it, and she was so intelligent, such an inspiration. So, how should we leave ourselves this evening? How can we improve? How can we cultivate our inner genius? Whatever that has been put in us that we love, how are we going to make it better? How are we going to build upon it? Okay, let's self-improve. Enjoy.